the original system of order, let's say, the original placeholders in order to denote one thing from another were the numbers. The numbers were here before we were. The numbers came before anything else. And if anything more than a unit of counting, they represent specific archetypes. But today I want to talk about how two specific numbers, that being 5 and 6, are actually responsible for the alleged slave matrix we're experiencing right now. Okay, so let's get right into it. So essentially, when we look at the world and its affinity for money, its affinity for especially taking money and equating it to a certain amount of time, we have to think about the different values that are associated with that, right? So if we look at our time is counted in 60s, right? 60 seconds, 60 minutes in an hour. Okay, so this is 6, right? This is the same as the six-sided star, the Star of David, if you will, right? Then if you look at our money is counted in 5s, right? You have 50 cents, you have the 1, the 5, the 10, and this one goes up to 100. So we have the pentagram, a 5-based system, and then we have the hexagram, a 6-based system. And the way that the two of these come together actually create a sort of matrix that keeps the world trapped in this system of slavery, like I mentioned. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the symbology behind this and why this actually is significant to understand, and also how we can rise above it, how we're being trapped into it, right? Okay, so first I want to talk about this idea of the job, right? Where this world, in order to make a living, as they call it, make life, you have to go and get a job. At least that's what we're taught. And this job is based on you can make this much money per this much time, which is another way of saying you can gain this many pentagrams, which, remember, the pentagrams are stars. Okay, so they're saying you can gain this much power by within this hexagram, which is your time. Okay, so they're using these geometries to actually put your own energy, which is your time and your life essence, into a system that can be controllable. Okay, now let's go into the word job and what that means. So in the Bible, there was somebody named Job, right? It's spelled J-O-B, but it's pronounced J-O-H-B, like Job. And this story is pretty interesting because I think this relates to essentially how on the dollar they have "In God We Trust." And I want to touch back on this, as I stated in my previous videos, that God was not the divine mother. That's not the supreme creator. So when they're saying "In God We Trust," they're talking about a star. They're talking about a phi-based being. And typically, like in this context, it was Yahweh, right? It was one of these creators that were the Anunnaki. And these Anunnaki had a lot of symbology left behind from times like Sumeria, where Sumeria used the 60 to count their money, to count everything. They used this system of 60 because 60 was actually a number very highly associated with Anu, which was like the high king of the Anunnaki. And 60 was like this like divine number to them. So that's where that started in Sumeria. And now we're using 5s, but why did that change? So like I said, in God we trust, okay? So I want to tell you this story here. I did take a note of this just because I want to convey it correctly. So Job, right? The Lord's praise of Job prompts an angel with the title of Satan, adversary, to suggest that Job served God simply because God protected him. God removes Job's protection and gives permission to the angel to take his wealth, his children, and his physical health, but not his life. Despite his difficult circumstances, he does not curse God, but rather curses the day of his birth. And although he anguishes over his plight, he stops short of accusing God of injustice. Job's miserable earthly condition is simply God's will. In God we trust. Right, my friends? So this is a story that I believe it's happening now, with where we have this system where people are just saying, in God we trust. They're trusting in this God. As I've spoken, a lot of the world is still praying to some sort of external power, external force. And if we look at currency and we look at what currency means, it is current, right? It is the energy, the current, the electricity. It is something that can be used to power projection. And the same way that I've spoken about the language being a representation of what language is rather than the language itself, the dollars, the paper that we use, or whatever country you're from, that is a representation of the current, but not the current itself. This is an important distinction to make because they're essentially taking current, which is spiritual energy, and they're putting it into a certain system based on certain geometries. And when they do this, they can tie it to some sort of God, some sort of entity that you trust in it, so you can do whatever you want with it. I think the word trust is interesting too, because in legal terms, what you would call a trust is treated as like an entity in itself. So like when you're saying that like this is a trust that you have, it's literally saying like here is this entity and this thing has power over you. Nobody owns it, but you are you are subservient of it, which this is really important. So as far as the pentagram goes, this is a really interesting connection with this because on our money, this is also why even if you were to argue that our system is based, the American system is based on ones, not fives. If you go down to the smallest unit, which is a penny, there's still a person on that, right? There's still a face, right? And it's a dead president. So this is another form of them taking a star, which is a being, it is a phi-based being, and actually using that dead being's power to actually create a projection, to actually project the reality that they want by taking these currents and actually turning them into a talisman, essentially. And this is what's happening because they've got us fooled into believing in this false God, which is technically our current that's being placed into this matrix of the 6 and the phi, right? So as far as the 60 goes, time, as we know it, time is the sun, right? Time is the sun, and if you subdivide that further down, it is the moon and the way that they rotate around the earth. That is time, and that is the original source of time. What we're using now is based on the 60, just to reaffirm that, okay? The phi's that we're getting are how many of those can fit within the 60s. So essentially we have a 6-sided star and a 5-sided star operating within each other, and within that and within the God that we trust, they are trapping our energy. Because so long as we are observing this trap outside of ourselves, we are not recognizing that we are the star power ourselves. Okay, here I drew a little picture of this to actually try to make a better point of how this looks. Okay, so a pentagram, a convex pentagram, meaning that all of the points are pointing outward. This is a healthy star. This is the powers coming from the inside and it's going outward. This is a concave pentagram. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it is caved in on itself. This is a star that is looking for power outside of itself. This is a star that is dying. And this is essentially the state of the world that they have us in right now. And then obviously we have the 2 triangles, or we have the 6-pointed star, we have the hexagram. So this is our time, this is our money, and this is what's happening so long as we are fooled into thinking that the stars, which are the dead beings that they put on our money, are actually the power. Remember, this whole system of worship, this whole system of these gods and deities are based on dead gods and deities, getting us to pray to these ideas of these sacrifices and things like that. That is just taking us into this underworld matrix, essentially, where they have these stars having power over us, rather than us recognizing that we are the stars and cultivating that inward power. Now, this is important to realize. Let me draw this on here real quick, because I don't think I can do it backwards. Well, so essentially, this is the energetic matrix of how these work. Okay, so where you have this star that understands that this power is coming from the inside, the energy swirls outward. This is how the 5 turns into the 6, by the way. And then you have the concave star where it's trying to get something from the outside because it's trying to fill that hole within itself. So this also comes with the mind, with the energy, with what we're manifesting. So long as we are looking at something outside of ourself, we are always going to be this shape, which is you collapsing on yourself. And this is how all these systems have been designed. This is why they're using this. I mean, this is these talismans. They're literally using these geometries to enslave the mind and to create this situation on the earth where they're taking your time and they're turning it into geometry, and then they're deciding how many pentagrams you can actually get for that geometry. But we have to realize, my friends, is the value lies within us. Okay? The value lies in us actually recognizing that we are the stars that we're looking at outside of ourselves, and then coming and shining that light here. And the money, the current that we receive and generate as a result of that is the star power that is natural spiritual energy that has nothing to do with these currents. It has nothing to do with these talismans. Okay? Has everything to do with the current. Let me be clear about that. This is also why I find the concept of cryptocurrency very interesting, right? Because you have the word crypt in there. So, right, it's finally putting these dead entities to bed. It's taking these dead spirits and these talismans and it's finally putting them into the crypt, right? They're dead now. Now we're into a currency that is not based on some sort of entity that has been made into a talisman, but it's more based off of actual exchange. No longer these methods of magic, essentially, that are keeping us enslaved. So this is also interesting. One more note that I have on here, because this is obviously a really dense topic, but hour, if we look at the word hour, like how many hours in a day, that comes from the root or. And if you look at that, that stems back to Orion, and that stems back to ore, like gold, right? So this is another way that the language is actually connotating our time, in other words, to wealth, where it's saying this much time for this much wealth, because they realized that in a system where they can essentially quantify your time and quantify how many pentagrams, in other words, how many stars you can actually accumulate in order to power your projection within that limitation of that six-pointed star. This is how they're keeping us at bay. This is why the whole world is chasing after money for the most part. And everyone is trying to get that figured out just so you can, live a free life. So you don't have to be essentially a slave to the matrix, as I mentioned here earlier on. Now, I don't want to come off as like money's a bad thing. I've even talked about in my previous videos that it's like money is important, especially if you are looking to live a free and sovereign life. Money is something that's important, but how we go about getting it and how we go about perceiving it and understanding how it's a reflection of us, that is very important. Okay? Because if we're doing the societal program thing where we're just chasing money, and we're chasing these pentagrams by using our hexagrams, that's a debt-based system, my friends. That's what we have to understand about these dead systems, these dead talismans, is that it is a debt-based system. It is the underworld, because they are not alive. It is not a living currency. It's not the living current, right? It is fiat most of the time. And at one point, it was the ore most of the time, which was the hour, right? Which was the 60. Making sense? So, my friends, I want you to understand that within these two stars going over the top of each other, we see this matrix essentially taking place, where they have us chasing outside of ourselves in order to get our star to collapse upon itself, to be sucking in the energy and bringing it downward. Instead of being a star that is empowered and it's casting this energy outward, you are influencing the reality, shining your light on the reality rather than trying to take from it. Which, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having a job if that's the situation that you're in right now. It's part of the experience, and for the most part, it is such a dominant Babylonian style matrix that we're experiencing right now that it can be hard to get out of. I'm not denying that. But to understand this should help you, because you need to recognize that the power has always been within you, but they program us to feel like, oh, if I don't do this, then I'm going to run out of this and I'm going to have this. And they get us into this low vibrational state where instead of casting our energy out like the star that we are, we're saying, and then this shape, the geometry becomes concave. It caves in on itself. We begin losing power. We begin losing our true essence, which is what we need to actually create what we need to create here. My friends, if you understood the power that you hold within yourself and how you could actually cultivate that power and manifest through that power in this space, I mean, it would be game over. But the programming goes deep, right? These geometries are no joke, and they can easily cast these reflections on our mind that shape our destiny, that shape our pathways, and that shape how we're even perceiving what's possible in the space, right? These geometries, I mean, these shapes, these angles, they are trapping mechanisms. It is just as I've mentioned with the language before. The language is like a prism in the mind, and the light shines through it depending on the shape and texture of that prism. It actually makes the reality appear a certain way. Now, with me, place these geometries over you, and these aren't the only ones, by the way. These are all over the place. And again, don't think of geometries themselves as bad. It's about putting them in the correct place. It's about understanding where they actually belong and how they're being used. Because once you crack the code to this matrix and see how it's actually functioning, you're going to understand like what you are in relation to that. Like I said, they've got you looking outward at stars. They've got you looking at the dead stars, which are the entities, the beings that are in the underworld, and they've got you praying to them. They've got you looking for Job, and they've got you trusting God, right? But what you have to understand, my friends, is you are the supreme being that is beyond God. You are the essence that transcends and stands within and above all of this. You are beyond it. You are more than that. But we have to deprogram and really get to know ourselves on that deeper level in order to see this. You're powerful beyond what you could possibly conceive. But we have been programmed in this reality. We live in a reality where the programming is normal and people just say it is what it is. How many people get up and go to their work on a day where they say, you know, they go to the 5-day work week and then it's the weekend. They go through the week, the WEAK. They feel weak during the 5 days, and then now the week is over. And we had these 2 days to just not be weak. And then we're going to be weak for 5 days, right? It's this whole system of trying to trap you in this weakened state because your power is what would break the system. The more of us that realize this and actually step into our purpose, step into our calling, step into doing things you're passionate about, where you can actually change how the system is functioning. In other words, instead of trading your time for something, imagine trading value for something, right? There's nothing wrong with the pentagrams. There's nothing wrong with the hexagrams. It's a matter of how they're being placed together. Stop treating your time as it's only worth this many pentagrams. Start treating yourself as the pentagram. Power yourself up. Give yourself what you need to actually thrive and be a high level being, a high value being, and then go and put that out into the world, right? This is how people become wealthy on this planet. I'm talking about even the physical sense of wealth. They're no longer working within this specific matrix, which is this correlation between time and money. Okay, I'm not going to beat a dead horse with this concept, but this is so important. It's not natural that we have the Job thing going on, right? There's nothing wrong with working. Like if there's people that are doing things that they're passionate about and that's their Job and it works like that for them, fine, so be it. But what I'm saying is there are higher levels of consciousness that are much more free and expansive. And that comes along with you no longer treating time as something that is a commodity, because that is also the lower level matrix, because time is not linear, right? Like I said, the sun is like the original timescape, and we only have so much time to live. Despite us being immortal beings that are here, we have so much time to actually be in this life, and it doesn't have to be where the two things are put together in that specific way, but they have put it together in that specific way to trap you, okay? So my friends, I don't want to go too far with this. I don't want to go too deep with this. I don't want to repeat myself too much. It's just such an intrinsic and important concept to recognize this Babylonian matrix, and how your time is a shape, how your money is a shape. Okay, so within that, you have to recognize you are the power. You have always been the power. It has always been within you. And with that, my friends, be whole, be well, and we'll talk soon. All right, take care.